Well, welcome to the Abundantly More podcast. I'm Hannah Lynn Miller. I'm your host. And today I have my friend Kami Schwartz. She is a reproductive health doula, and we're going to talk about mental health support during pregnancy and postpartum. I'm so excited about this conversation. Welcome, Kami.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah. Well, let's get started and you just tell me about what you do and how you got started becoming a doula.
Yes, it's a good question. It's been a long journey of kind of figuring out exactly what I do. So when I was in high school, I learned about a birth doula, and really that's someone that just walks with someone through pregnancy and attends births with a couple. And I kind of just provide education and support and hip squeezes and massages during labor and really help with baby positioning and all kinds of different things throughout the labor process. And then provide breastfeeding and postpartum support as well. So that's what I started off as. And then I got really interested in periods and fertility as well. And so I became a certified fertility educator. And
Hmm.
so now I really work with women starting in puberty as they, start to navigate their reproductive health and then all the way into pregnancy and postpartum and then even further into perimenopause. So that's what I do now. It's so much fun. And that's why I like to call it a reproductive health doula, because I really am just coming alongside women as they navigate their reproductive health all the way through the whole process.
That's so cool because I think all those things can be so intimidating and scary, and new every time, for everyone. I
Exactly.
mean, just
Yes.
starting with the period, like that's
Right.
terrifying.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. I like to say I work in life's transitions,
Yeah.
so kind of the major things that women go through, like you said, starting with, okay, now I have to worry about my period. And then later on, now I have to worry about my fertility. And then now I'm becoming a mom. And then even further into like perimenopause and all of the transitions that go with that. So yes,
Yeah.
there's so much new going on there, like you said. And that really just brings up lots of different emotions and questions. And there's often like spiritual transitions going on during that time as well. So it's really, really a rich time to be walking with women.
Yeah, definitely. Because, like you said, it's a lot of new. Our bodies just change so much, and so it's hard to keep up with. So having that support is really important. What do you think, like, got you interested? Like, what made you think, oh, this is what I want to be doing, going forward?
Yeah, I just always think it's such a funny story because when I found out that I wanted to be a doula, I was probably like 16 or so, 17 maybe.
Hmm.
And I was not really interested in my own births or anything at
Hmm.
that point. But it was really like I went to school one day and I found out about a doula from one of my teachers. He was just like, yeah, my sister's a doula. And I was like, what? And from that day on, it was just like, this is what I want to be. And I don't know why. I don't know what drew me to it, but I really can only think that like it was God just being like, here's your calling.
Yeah, because
And
because it
yeah, go ahead.
wasn't when like you were having kids and realizing, oh, it'd be nice to be supportive or have the support. Okay.
Right. Yeah, most doulas will start their careers around the time that they're, having their own babies or after they have their first baby, they realize, oh, this is a missing link.
Hmm.
But yeah, for some reason, it was just when I was in high school. And so my
Wow.
friends literally started calling me Kamdoula at that point, and it just became part of my identity, I would say,
Wow.
at that age. And so it's fun to look back and it's, 15 years later and I'm still doing it, but
That's
it
cool.
really does feel like it's just more and more of who I am,
Mhm.
kind of coming to this work.
Yeah, I love that. And when did you start actually practicing? I don't know if that's how you call it, but when did you start making it
Yeah.
a job?
Yes. So when I was engaged to my husband, so that would have been in 2015, I started birth work for the first time as a birth assistant in a Amish birth center that we have here locally.
Okay.
So that's when I had my first several births. I would go really just kind of at the end of the labor when they started to push and be there to help chart things and help with baby care and all of that. So that was when I first started. So 2015. So we're looking at 9 years ago now, which is really
Wow.
crazy. Yeah.
That's so much experience. Have you
Yes.
like had like a running count of how many births you've been a part of?
So I didn't start counting until the last several years, so it's not quite accurate, but I'm somewhere around 60 now,
Oh
something like that.
my word.
Yeah, so it's so
Cool.
fun. It's so fun to see um how like I know now what birth typically looks like, but it's always a surprise. It always unfolds
Yeah.
differently even after, yeah, 60 of them.
Yeah, okay, that's wild that you feel that way because I feel like that's true just talking to friends and stuff. I'm like, okay, like literally you can prepare for anything, but it's always different and everybody's experience is so different. So
Yeah,
that's funny that you feel
absolutely.
that way too. Okay, about 60 births. And talking about that, like, what do you think, because everything is different and new and that can cause some anxiety, right? And
Mhm.
so like, what do you think are the major, like maybe the top mental health issues or challenges that you've found women to face?
Yeah, so definitely, like you mentioned, there's a lot of fear and anxiety surrounding birth and even pregnancy as well, particularly if there's been any like pregnancy loss before, if they've had a miscarriage or have had trouble getting pregnant. There's lots of different emotions and just like mental health issues that come up with that. And I think pregnancy, like I mentioned, is such a huge life transition. So there's so much that comes into like, am I ready to be a mom? And we also process our own childhoods quite a bit more in depth in pregnancy. And
Mm-hmm.
that can bring up lots of different mental health concerns as well. And we do know that if there has been any trauma, especially in childhood, it is often going to resurface in pregnancy in a new way. Sometimes it's really the first time that a woman will actually start to process her own childhood trauma. And
Really?
yeah, yeah.
I don't know why
So,
I've never thought of that before, but
yeah.
you found that to be true.
Yes, yep.
Mhm.
So there's a really great book called When Survivors Give Birth by Penny Simkin that goes
Okay.
over all of this and the way that pregnancy can really re-trigger trauma. And some of it is just, medical care. Obviously, we are dealing with the pelvis and the reproductive health system, and so that can trigger lots of different memories in your prenatal care.
Mm.
Sharing your body with another person can bring up lots of memories as well. And so, yeah, it really, and like I mentioned, just like the thought of bringing a child into the world, you think about your own childhood so much. So it becomes a lot more important, I think, for a lot of women to start thinking about that, about their own childhood and a lot of the memories that come up with that. So it can really be an intense time for different mental health issues, if especially
Yeah.
there's been sort of unprocessed trauma.
So would you say that like would you recommend I mean, how does that come up in conversation? I mean, okay, I got two questions. So the first one is would you recommend women like kind of if they're thinking about getting pregnant and like starting a family to start processing their childhood? Is that something that you would recommend?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a big part of the preconception stage and thinking about pregnancy. If you, of course, have the time to do that, right? Not
Mm,
everybody has the luxury of thinking through these things and getting prepared before pregnancy. Sometimes pregnancy happens and then we
yeah.
have to start thinking about it right then. So, but
Mm,
absolutely, I think that thinking through these things beforehand helps so much. And certainly when I'm working with women who are trying to get pregnant and working through fertility issues, we're often talking about childhood or different trauma or different things that can affect their mental health,
Mm.
because we know that mental health and reproductive health are so tightly correlated. There's so much that they're affecting each other.
Oh, wow.
So
I
it's certainly something we talk about quite a bit.
Yeah. So tell me more about that. So you shared that it can be linked
Hmm.
in fertility. Like what do you find is the biggest link there?
Yeah, well, stress of any kind is really going to
Okay.
affect the way that our reproductive system works. We always say, reproductive health is a luxury, something that our body pays attention to when everything else is taken care of, because
Mm.
having a child is not part of our own survival. And our body is always going to prioritize our own survival first. And so if we're working through, constant stress or constant fight or flight, or, being in sort of that like, fight or flight mode all the time, as we, maybe haven't processed, trauma and how it's affecting us, then our body is going to down regulate the reproductive system. And so we either will not be having periods as often, or when we do have periods, they're, maybe heavier or lighter than what we typically will see, because we just have sort of this sort of down regulation, like I said. So estrogen and progesterone are going to be at lower levels. And so we're not going to have quite as like a healthy, strong ovulation as we typically would. And that's really our body's way of protecting us
Mm.
and saying, like, hey, we're still working on our own survival, making sure we're safe, making sure we have the resources as far as like, food and um, the ability to recover and feel safe before we're going to put all of our energy into reproductive or reproduction, really.
Wow. Our bodies are so smart that way. Like that's so interesting. I guess I've never thought of it that way, like that our bodies are first going to prioritize our health. And
Hmm.
then when everything's good, they think
Yep,
about reproducing another life.
exactly.
What do you think is a huge thing? Say someone is in that stage, they're, wanting to become pregnant. They know that
Mhm.
there's a lot of stress, and are worried that maybe their mental health, poor mental health is maybe affecting things. What would you say is the first thing to do?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always recommending people go to therapy as part of their whole journey
Mm.
to conceiving. Not only because of what I've just mentioned, right? Like it's such a huge part of it, but when we start the process of trying to conceive, that brings up its own emotions and different, fears and mindsets and things like that. So to have a therapist that you're walking through all of this with is so helpful, because I think it's just so important to do it all with intention. And we often don't realize like how much all of it is going to affect us until we're in it. And then even when we're in it, it's really hard to see how much weight we're carrying
Mm.
ourselves. So to have somebody else, a therapist, or of course, I, love walking alongside of my clients as well as they're working through all of these things. So someone
Totally.
who can help them work through these things and kind of carry the weight of all of the different emotions that come along with it, I think can be so helpful.
Yeah, it's just nice to have a sounding board. And I think that's really when you break down talk therapy, like that's a huge thing. I think just repeating back, like hearing what you're thinking out loud sometimes can
Mhm.
be so therapeutic. And sometimes you need somebody to bring that out so that you realize, oh, actually, what I'm going through is really, really hard to process.
Exactly.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Um, you talk a lot about faith and how that also, um, kind of correlates and kind of weaves through these issues. So, what do you think? How do you think like faith and mental health can help someone who is in that process?
Yeah, absolutely. So it starts with what you just said a little bit ago about how our bodies are so wise. And I think that's really important to realize. That's one of the first things I cover with a client is their view of their own body.
Mm,
And when we start to realize how wise the body is created, that's when we start to realize how great of a creator we have,
mm,
because it's really easy to we've often, been taught like our bodies are broken, right? We live in a broken world and there's sin in the world and that's affected our bodies. And there's truth to that, but we sometimes miss then how expertly and intricately God designed our reproductive health system
mm,
to, like you said, just like down regulate fertility in certain seasons of stress. And so that's one of the first things we start to examine is what are you thinking about the way that God created your body
mm,
and the way that he created you. It's also all very, again, kind of intertwined as we think about, what is my calling? What does God have for my future? What plans does he have in mind for me? And so we start to really unpack a lot of that as women are processing either getting pregnant or they're already pregnant or they're already mothers and trying to work through that. So I think that faith, I just can't really separate.
yeah.
And, I can't talk about, how we're doing in our
Mm,
reproductive systems without talking about how we're doing in our mental health. And I can't talk about mental health without talking about, where you're at spiritually and what you're thinking on a, bigger sense of what God is saying to you. And
mm,
then one of the other things that I have really been enjoying learning more about is the fall of man and how there were some consequences that came when, Adam and Eve ate the fruit. And there were really like four consequences that God lined out. And one of them is that we have reproductive health issues
mm,
and that women are going to experience that. And the King James Version really says there will be sorrows and conception. So everything that kind of goes along with conception, whether that's the hormones that are involved that can get all kind of out of whack, or the periods that are interfering with our lives, or pregnancy loss, infertility, and then postpartum issues as well. All of those things are kind of packed into this consequence. But what I love to say is that was one verse in the Bible, and then God spent the rest of the Bible working through and creating this rescue plan for us
mm,
and, bringing Jesus. And we know that we have the prophecy about Jesus where he carried our sorrows, right? And so we have these sorrows and conception that happen in the fall of man, but then we also have Jesus carrying those sorrows for us. And
mm,
so, really, I really believe that God is very aware of reproductive health issues. I think this is a big area where
mm,
we see this happening in the fall, but now it's a big part of the restoration as well. So, really just inviting God into that journey, whether it is a period problem or a pregnancy
yeah.
problem or, whatever it may be, postpartum issues, really inviting Him in and allowing Him to bring healing, whatever that might look like, right? So, it might be like supernatural, miraculous healing, but it might also be that he is going to heal those other areas that are affecting our reproductive health, like trauma or disordered eating or whatever it might be, that there's sort of this full area, this deeper healing that he wants for us through these issues. So I've really been enjoying just kind of bringing the whole picture to him and with my clients as they are navigating these things.
Wow. I mean, that is so powerful. And it does just to remind me that we are, mind, body, and spirit, and you can't really separate those things. And I'm with you. It's really hard for me to separate mental health and faith
Yeah.
because they're
Yeah.
so intertwined when you bring theology in. But that is so beautiful. I don't think I've ever heard it so well put. The reproductive process and faith. I think that's really, really cool. So we've talked about that beginning stage of like planning a little bit, thinking about it and then also the issues that can come along with conceiving. But can you tell me a little bit about during pregnancy, what are some things that women or that you suggest to women to just practice self-care during pregnancy, that process? And maybe even like throw in some things about like, I don't know, just like anxiety that can happen. Like maybe it's your second kid and you're thinking about all of that. The fact that, oh my gosh, I got to do this again. And maybe that
Hmm.
birth was traumatic.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. There's so much to unpack there. And I mean, I think that like you've mentioned, and like I always am kind of encouraging people to do, is like really just being intentional. It's super easy to have these anxieties that come up and think, well, I'm just not going to think about them, right? Like we'll deal with that when we get there.
Yeah.
But the problem with that is those things just live in our head and they just get more and more and more intense until we actually deal with them. And so I find that a lot of my clients are really trying to do the whole just like, let's just not think about it. Let's not go there. Let's not talk about it. And that way I am beating these anxieties, right? Like if I don't talk about it, they're not real. But
Yeah.
that obviously just does not
It's
work. So
not
that's the
true.
first thing. That's the first thing is just to really be intentional and really combating them and allowing them to surface and bring whatever they need to bring to you. And so one of the things I talk a lot about in birth class is fear processing. And that's specifically when we're talking about, fear of birth. And like you said, it might be the second one when the first one
Mhm.
was not good or whatever. It was traumatic in whatever way. So it might be that, it might be it's your first one and you just have no idea what to expect, or it might be that you have heard some really scary stories and so those things are kind of stuck in your head. So whatever it is, we take time to actually name those fears with as much detail as they're willing to give. It's really easy to just say, I'm afraid something's going to go wrong.
Mm.
But often when we talk more about that, there is specific things that they're afraid are going to go wrong. And when they say those things out loud, then they can connect it to either a memory or a story they heard or, something happened with their mom or their sister and now they're afraid that that might have, a genetic component or something like that. So really trying to name those fears with as much detail as possible, I
I
think
love
can be
that.
really helpful.
Hmm.
And then when you can name it, you can also learn more about it. So that's, I think, another one of the really important things is once I name my fear, then I want to learn how my provider handles this, right? If this were to happen, what are my treatment options? What are ways that I can navigate this? Who am I going to go to? Who is my, therapist or whatever that I'm going to reach out to, some friends that I'm going to reach out to, things like that. So I think that's really important as well, just to have a greater understanding of how things are managed because most of the time, especially when it comes to birth, we hear so many scary stories all the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
And we just hear the scary thing and we don't hear the whole plan that the provider had to manage those things.
Mm.
And most of the time there's so much training and thought that goes into that really if we knew that would help us feel a lot more at peace. So that's one of the things I really recommend in pregnancy is just being really aware of and intentional about fears that come up.
Yeah, that's really good. It's being proactive, like naming the
Yes.
fear and then being proactive, like how can I learn more and just feel better about that situation. So that's
Hmm.
really helpful. My another question that I have for you is how to, and look, we're just gonna like move along to like postpartum.
Hmm.
What do you think is the major sign that it's not just baby blues and that there is some postpartum depression happening?
Yeah, great question. So I always like to make sure that I point out when you are, especially in the first 2 weeks postpartum, you are recovering from birth, which may have been traumatic, or if it wasn't traumatic, it may have still been, difficult, long, tiring.
Hmm.
You probably are no longer getting sleep the way that you typically have. You are trying to learn how to breastfeed potentially, and that may or may not be going well. You might have a lot of pain in your body with breastfeeding or just after birth. And you are also trying to take care of a baby. And that's like 24/7 care. I think that hits people really hard after they've had, especially their first baby,
Yeah.
what it really means to take care of a helpless newborn 24/7. On top of that, we also have the biggest hormone swing that a woman will ever experience. So, estrogen and progesterone levels are super high at the end of pregnancy, and within a week or two postpartum, they are back down to baseline levels or even lower than that. And so, it's a huge hormonal swing,
Mm.
something that they will never, we don't experience this in any other parts of our lives. And so, there's so much going on there. The first 2 weeks, because of that, there's lots of different emotions, ups and downs, crying. You feel happy, you feel really sad, you feel really tired. And so it's very easy to just have lots of emotions. And that's what we would call the baby blues.
Mm.
When we get to the 2 week mark, we want to start to see things start to settle out a little bit. Not that everything's going to be great or easy or anything like that. You're not going to have a routine or, whatever, but we want to feel that things are more stable at that 2 week mark. So that's what I always tell my clients and their, husbands or partners. Really be aware at the 2 week mark of how things are going. And if it feels like things have not gotten any better or they're getting worse, or we're dealing with things like anxiety to where I don't have an appetite or my baby's
Mm.
sleeping, but I can't sleep, that's when we really want to look into it more thoroughly and, potentially get some help either from the provider or start therapy or things like that. That 2 week mark is really important. Not that, like I said, not that everything has to be perfect at 2 weeks. It's not going to be, but we want to just feel like, okay, things are a little bit more stable now. And then each week it tends to get a little bit more stable. Like even so if you gave birth on a Friday, I always recommend just like checking in on a Friday. How am I feeling this week compared to the week before?
Mm.
And really just monitoring that the same way that you'd monitor your bleeding postpartum, and just checking like, are things getting better? Are we moving in the right direction? Rather than it can be so easy to place a lot of emotional weight on how am I doing. But try to think of it more like you would your bleeding and just pay attention to, is my body kind of adjusting the way that it typically should?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's like you're monitoring your physical symptoms. Why not
Yeah.
monitor your emotional symptoms as well? I think too, depression is so interesting because it's this like so you're supposed to be experiencing the highs and lows, right? Like
Hmm.
that's normal, and even if it's like very low sometimes, that's normal. And but like depression is when you're always at this level,
Yeah.
for a long period of time. So I like that, having like a time of checking in so that you make sure, hey, like, am I good? Have I been good and improving every week? That makes a lot of sense. I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And like you said, there is so much joy that comes along with having a child. I mean, if we're not experiencing that, that's
Yes.
definitely something we want to look into further.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, this was so good. And we'll have to have you back and talking more about reproductive health because you're right, it's so intertwined. And this has been so helpful, Cami. Thank you for your time and for just all your expertise and what you do for women every day.
You're welcome. Thanks so much for having me. Of course, I love talking about this stuff and yeah, talk about it all the time.
I love it. We'll do it again.